So, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I understand that this event is being held in person after almost 2 years. And that's due to COVID. So I know COVID impacted many of us, and one of the good things that came out of COVID was ONDC. It was during COVID that the government realized that they weren't able to provide essential supplies to quite a few citizens in the country. And that was when they realized the limitations of the existing platforms, such as, that are there today, the penetration of those platforms plus their reach. So there were cases where there are communities in which there are people that are users of one particular platform. They are not able to get essential supplies from merchants in a different platform, and all those kinds of issues that were noticed. So at that time, the government came up with this concept of ONDC, and there were two underlying themes. One is unbundling, and second is interoperability. So I'll get into the details of each one of these. But what unbundling means is that instead of a platform, we separate out the buyer side of the platform from the seller side. So in other words, we separate out the demand and the supply. The buyer app, it brings in the demand. The seller apps, they bring in the supply. And what we try to do in ONDC is to match supply and demand at scale. So I'll get into some of the other details about ONDC. But what I'll do today is, I know this is a tech-savvy audience, and I know there are a lot of people who are also watching it online. So I'll talk about ONDC. I'll give an overview of what exactly ONDC is, some of the technical underpinnings of ONDC, and get into the key theme for today, which is democratizing digital commerce. So why exactly are we doing ONDC? How are we planning to democratize digital commerce? Some of the tech initiatives, there are quite a few interesting things that we are doing in tech, and tech opportunities for many of you, and startups and others that want to engage with ONDC. There are actually a lot of opportunities that you can look forward to. So without further ado, I'll get started with what exactly the ONDC network is. So I'll start with the foundational principles for ONDC network. Now, it is based on decentralization. So this is not a single platform, but this is completely decentralized. Now, what exactly is decentralization? So there is no center, unlike other things that you're aware of. For example, UPI, there is a center, but in ONDC there is no center. So what we do is we just provide the enabling infrastructure for different participants to interact on ONDC. The interoperability is where any buyer, so we bring in different kinds of applications onto ONDC, and I'll get into some of the details later on. But the interoperability part is that anyone can come with a buyer app, and you'll be able to find merchants that provide a particular GODA service. So for example, any merchant that comes onto ONDC, they'll get access to demand, from the different buyer apps which are there. Plus any buyer app, if you are bringing in demand, then you can get access to supply. So that is where we are talking about interoperability. Any app can talk to any other app through an interoperable protocol. It is open, whatever we are doing, including our protocol, plus a lot of the other tech around ONDC, that is open. And it is available with an open source license. And it's actually open so that anybody that wants to build an app, they can actually come and develop an app using the protocol that is available. Plus there are a lot of building blocks that we also provide for ONDC. Our role as a ONDC organization is to facilitate participants. So we are not, we are not a part of the network. All that we do is we facilitate the different participants that want to be on ONDC, and we try to engage with them so that they can work with one another to conduct digital commerce. There is minimalistic governance. It is participant centric. The democratization and innovation. So these are some of the underlying principles. I'll get into the tech part in most detail. But some of the things that actually guide us is the decentralization and the interoperability part of ONDC. Now, this is what the protocol looks like for ONDC. So at the base layer, we have the beacon protocol. Now, the beacon protocol, the chief architect for the beacon protocol is Dr. Pramod Verma. So I think all of you are familiar with his name. So he was the one who designed the beacon protocol. Now, the beacon protocol, it provides APIs and models for digital commerce transactions. Now, digital commerce, so one of the things that Beacon has done is that they have taken any digital commerce transaction and they have standardized it into a few small steps. So there is a discovery, there is a fulfillment, there is a post-fulfillment. Now, if you look at the Beacon protocol itself, it's a very simple and a lightweight protocol that enables digital commerce in a lot of different domains. So in other words, anywhere a buyer and seller can conduct digital commerce, they could use Beacon protocol to do that. So that is the base layer of the ONDC protocol, which is the APIs and models for digital commerce transactions. And on top of that, what we have is a network extension layer. Now the network extension layer, it includes different things that are required to actually operate the network. So that has things like grievance, policies, online dispute resolution, open data, even registration. So whatever is required on top of the base protocol to operate a network, that is there in the network extension layer. Now the key part of the network extension layer is what we call as transaction contracts. Now transaction contracts is actually what ensures the interoperability between the buyer and the seller apps. So that talks about the minimum that is required to actually get a transaction through between a buyer and a seller app. So that's the transaction contract, and what we do is in ONDC we enable transaction contracts for a lot of different domains. So example, how do you conduct a retail transaction? If you want to do a retail search, for example, what is the minimum amount of information that you need to pass to get a search through, and what is the minimum amount of information that you expect to see in the response for a search, for example. To publish a catalog onto a buyer app, or to even do a checkout, or to actually confirm an order, what is the minimum amount of information that is required to do that? So that is kind of the that is what underpins the network, which is to make sure that the information is passed the same way by different participants, and whatever validations are required, those are also enforced, so that when two different participants talk to one another, there is no ambiguity in terms of what is expected and what is provided. Now, the key features of this protocol, if you look at it, it's an open protocol with a community governance model. I already talked about it. Now, there are some interesting things that we've done. We have verifiable decentralized identity, which is DIDs. Now, the security architect for the Beacon protocol, what they did was, they took a key decision in terms of moving away from the existing security infrastructure of digital signature certificates and others. The thinking at that time was that, when we are talking about democratizing digital commerce and bringing in small merchants, you don't want a merchant to spend like 2 months in a government office to get a digital signature certificate, to actually do a digital transaction. So they took a decision to move away from digital signature certificates and towards verifiable decentralized identities. Now, DIDs is quite a common thing in tech today, but what we do in ONDC is that each participant, they generate their own decentralized identities, and using the decentralized identities, they can actually transact on the network. Because if you look at ONDC itself, it's a public network. All the endpoints are public. Anybody that wants to target the network, it's not very difficult to do. But we are still able to verify the different participants that transact on the network, and we are able to keep out, those that are not a participant on the network. So, for example, we are able to verify the identities of all the participants on the network, and we are also able to make sure that the transactions are not corrupted or tampered with in transit. The transactions on the ONDC networks, every request and response, that is digitally signed using the decentralized identities that each participant has. There is data privacy and security, which is enabled by design. So, for example, all the data in the network, that is actually owned by the participants. So, for example, if you talk about a buyer app, they have all the data for the different buyers, and the sellers, they have the seller apps, they actually have the data for all the different merchants, or all the different orders and transactions that happen on the network. Now, the bilateral negotiation. So this is a pretty interesting concept in ONDC. Now, what we are trying to do in ONDC is that we are trying to bring together buyers and sellers, each of whom will have their own policies and procedures in place. And we are just trying to enable them to talk to one another on ONDC. So in other words, we are not trying to enforce our own terms and conditions or rules or whatever. So what we do is, when two different participants come onto the ONDC network, we try to enable them so that they can actually talk to one another. So whatever policies and procedures they have in place, they try to negotiate with the counterparty, make sure that that is accepted. And once there is a bilateral negotiation happens and it concludes, then they're able to they're able to actually complete a transaction and get the transaction through. So the bilateral negotiation is actually a very key piece in the protocol, which just ensures that participants are able to, stick to their own terms and conditions and negotiate those terms and conditions with the counterparty. It's almost like, how things happen in the physical world. Now, the goal of the Beacon protocol and ONDC is global interoperability. So we are not just an India play. We want to ensure that there is interoperability at the global level, and that too, so if you look at the network itself, we have so many different domains, and so right now we are in retail, we are in logistics. We'll get into agri. There are other networks that are happening on Beacon, for example, UHI. There's a mobility network. So all of these networks, the goal is that all of these networks will be interoperable, and not just in India, but at a global level. So if you check the specs for the Beacon protocol or even for ONDC, we try to keep the global interoperability in mind, so that anybody that wants to operate a network, not just in India, but in any other country, they'll be able to do that. So this is basically what the ONDC protocol looks like. Now I'll tell you what exactly the network looks like. So this is what the ONDC network looks like. Now we try to make it a little bit more complicated, because I know techies love complicated things. So if you see the okay, so keep pressing it. Oh, okay. So if you see, we have, so these are what we call as domains, for example. So this is like hyperlocal. This is retail hyperlocal. This is one domain. There's a logistics domain. This could be an agri domain, which will come in future. This is a mobility domain. And this could be something else that comes up in future. So these are all what we would call as partitions in the network. It's like subnetworks within the network. Now, within this domain, within this business domain, what we try to do is we try to match, buyers and sellers. So there are buyer apps that come in. There could be different types of buyer apps. There could be different types of seller apps. So for example, there could be aggregators. There could be, so we have two different notations. We call it ISN and MSN. MSN is like an aggregator. They aggregate different types of merchants. Inventory seller is, this could be like a digital storefront for a Kirana store, for example. So if you see, this is the retail domain. Right now we are in hyperlocal, and this is something on which we are running a pilot. Now, what happens is there are different kinds of buyers that come in, and they're going through a buyer app. There is a component called the gateway. I'll get into what the gateway is for. But what happens is that the vertical dotted lines that you see, these are kind of the partitions, between the different networks. So this is the retail network, this is the logistics network, this is the agri network, this is the mobility network, and we also have plans to come up, for participants to actually come up with super apps, which can actually aggregate all these different kinds of networks and provide us a kind of unified interface, almost like I was talking to Umesh today, almost like the Gojek WeChat type of app. Now, in each domain, what we are trying to do is to match buyers and sellers. So buyer comes in through a buyer app, and sellers come in through seller apps. Now, we also have a boundary for the network. So if you see, we have something called network participants. So for example, a buyer app and a seller app, these are network participants, but a merchant may not be a network participant. Similarly, a buyer is not a network participant, but all the buyer apps, all the seller apps, and the gateway, these are actually the participants on the network. Now, the gateway is a pretty interesting component that we have in the network. What the gateway does is it enables discoverability. Now, if there is a buyer, so let's say if one of you comes in through a buyer app and you are searching for atta. Now, this is a demo that we've given many times before, and I know that there are lots of memes around this. So you come in and search for atta. So what happens is that the buyer app actually sends that search request to the gateway, and the gateway kind of does a broadcast of that search request based on some criteria to all the different seller apps which are there in the network. Now, what this means is that, let's say I have a small Kirana store, and I have registered on the network saying that, okay, I also have, I'm also in the hyperlocal space, and I have, I'm in the grocery segment, for example. Then I'll also get a chance to respond to that particular request. So it enables me to be discoverable. So I don't have to, go and convince any seller app or any buyer app to actually list me. So anytime there is a search request that happens on the network, I also get a chance to respond to that. Now that is the whole purpose of the gateway. It enables discoverability. And what happens is that when the search request goes to the gateway, it broadcasts it to all the participants. Now I'll also get a request to respond. Now whether I respond or not, that's up to me, but at least I get a chance to respond. So that is the purpose of the gateway. Now once the search responses come back and it shows up on the buyer app, then what the buyer will actually select something, to go and so let's say one of you went and searched for atta. You saw a response from, let's say, 3 different seller apps, all 3 of these. So after you select, atta from, let's say, this particular seller, then it becomes like a peer-to-peer transaction. There's no more need for the gateway. Now another point I wanted to mention is that if you take a merchant, if they come onto the network through any one particular seller app, then they are discoverable on the network. So it's not that they have to register with each and every seller or anything like that. So as long as they are part of any particular seller app, they'll be discoverable whenever there are search requests that are made. Now these are the different partitions inside the network, but there are also cases when we have this interesting concept called a cascaded transaction. So there is a retail transaction which happens in the ONDC network. So let's say one of you searches for atta, you get back a response from the seller app, and you decide to buy it. Now you want that to be shipped to you. So what you do is you look for a logistics provider on the network. So even in logistics, we have a logistics buyer app, we have logistics providers. So when you want to ship the atta to your home, then you can actually look for a logistic provider on the network. Now a logistics buyer app could either be a retail seller app or it could be a retail buyer app. Right now we've enabled it for the retail seller app. So retail seller app becomes a logistics buyer app, looks for logistics provider in the network, and this way what happens is you make a retail transaction in one network, and that is cascaded with a logistics transaction on the logistics network, so that there is an end-to-end flow which happens, starting from actually ordering, doing the discovery, searching for atta, then getting a logistics provider to do the fulfillment, and then actually tracking the fulfillment right till the end, which is the post-fulfillment part. So everything could be cascaded end to end. Now, this is one of the scenarios that we've actually got working today, but there are all kinds of scenarios that are possible, through this. Now, what we've done here is identified what is live in the network and what are things to be added. So the retail and the logistics, these are live in the network. And we actually started a pilot in the last week of April 29th to be exact. We started in Bangalore with less than 5 merchants, in some specific pin codes. And today we have a pilot which is running in almost 29 cities across the country. And there are more than 100 odd merchants, and we have lots and lots of SKUs which are there. So the scale of the pilot has also grown, and we are going to launch ONDC so as of now it works, we are calling it a pilot because it's for whitelisted users, but we are going to open it up for real users. So there'll be an announcement that will come from ONDC soon. So that was all about what exactly is ONDC, and the underlying protocol for ONDC. Now, the democratizing of digital commerce. How exactly do we plan to democratize digital commerce? So it primarily, rests on 3 things. The key themes for democratizing digital commerce is, one is we want to enable small merchants. And what the government realized during COVID is that the reach and the penetration of existing digital commerce platforms. So the penetration is like within single digits, plus there are lots of tier 3, tier 4 cities which are completely left out of the ambit of digital commerce. So what we want to do on, as ONDC is to make sure that we bring in a lot of small merchants and kirana stores onto the network. And Mr. Anil Agrawal, who is driving this initiative from the ministry, he keeps telling us that, मुझे वो कोने का पान वाला भी चाहिए ONDC पे, and he also wants kirana stores on ONDC. So he wants all those kinds of merchants to be a part of ONDC. Now, how do we enable small merchants? Typically, if you look at digital commerce platforms today, if you want to be a logistics provider, you need a pan-India presence pretty much. I mean, if you look at all the existing logistics provider on the network, for example, you need a pan-India presence. Or if you are like a retail aggregator or whatever, Without a pan-India presence, it's pretty much a no-go for you. But what we have in ONDC is we have an interesting mix of participants today. So you could be, let's say, a participant who, who enables, let's say, a few restaurants in the Whitefield area. You can be a part of the network. Plus, you could be a pan-India, let's say, supermarket software provider, who enables all the supermarkets on the network. So, we have both these types of participants who can coexist on the network. Now, how does it work? One is that the incentive for small merchants is that they are discoverable once they are on the network. They are discoverable, but they define their own serviceability boundaries. So, for example, I can say that okay, I operate a few restaurants in the Whitefield area, within like let's say 2 pin codes. I can be a part of the ONDC network, and there could be somebody else who has merchants, pan India in all the different cities. They could also be a part of the network. In terms of logistics, for example, we could have anybody with a pan India presence, whether you take anybody like a Shiprocket to eCart to Dunzo, and you can also have like Mohalla logistics providers who operate in like a few small localities. If in a few small pin codes, they could also be a part of the network. So because it is discoverable, there's an incentive for them to become a part of the network, and they define their own serviceability boundaries. So anytime anybody is looking for a particular product or a particular service, in a specific location, they get a chance to respond to that, and based on whether they're available in that location or not, they respond whether that is something that is serviceable for them, and they get to transact on their own terms and conditions. So this is very key. So the own terms and conditions could be anything as mundane as let's say there's a Kirana store. What are the return terms? What are the return terms? What are the cancellation terms? What are the payment terms? So there could be a lot, all these kinds of permutations and combinations that are there. But again, what we do is we enable them to transact on their own terms and conditions. Now, whether the buyer accepts it or not, or whether the buyer app accepts it or not, that is for them to discuss. We are not a part of it. Now, one of the goals of ONDC is to bring digital commerce to tier 3 and tier 4 cities. Now, this is a pretty interesting thing, because if you see many of the cities where we are running a pilot, these are cities where there has not been, any penetration of digital commerce so far. So, the small cities like, if you look at Bijnor or Udupi, these are cities where you won't find any existing digital commerce provider. And there was a recent case where we actually onboarded a merchant who's been operating a business, for the last 100 years, but they have not been a part of digital commerce so far. Now they have come onto ONDC through one of the participants. So I think in terms of our goal, which is to bring digital commerce to tier 3, tier 4 cities, once we enable merchants to be a part of the network and make it easy for them to actually be a part of the network and to operate it, I think and if we actually provide the tech and make it really lightweight and easy for them to adopt, then there is no reason why they can't be a part of the network. Plus, there are lots of other small. So some of the cities I mentioned. Plus, there are lots of other cities that we're also looking at, to be a part of the network. And one of our key goals is to bring in non-tech savvy buyers and sellers onto the network. Now, what we realized is that digital commerce has pretty much left out vast swaths of society. So we want to bring in a lot of these merchants and buyers, not just the small Kirana stores, but also buyers. I mean, if you look at who all use Amazon today, I mean, I used to use Amazon, so it's primarily tech-savvy buyers. People that understand tech, how to operate a mobile phone, and all those kinds of things. So it requires a certain level of tech savviness to actually use a digital commerce app today. So we want to break that barrier, make sure that we bring in as many tech-savvy buyers and sellers as possible onto ONDC. So if you look at the overall goals, it's basically we are trying to align the incentives of the network platform and end users, so that the collective, which is basically all the participants who are a part of the network, that they succeed, and our goal is basically to make sure that we align all their incentives, in a way that it is something that makes their effort worthwhile. Now, some of the tech initiatives that we are working on in ONDC, I'll get into the tech part after this. One is that there's a lot of, so if you look at ONDC, this is like a decentralized network. So in other words, there's no central catalog. So there's nothing, there is no centralized anything. So there is no central catalog, there is no central ledger, there's nothing, no central database, nothing like that. Now, a lot of these small kirana stores, if you look at it, they, if you look at their SKUs or the stock of products that they have, majority of that would be branded products. So, for example, Ashirvad Atta, it's probably there in every corner kirana store that you go to. Similarly, there'll be a lot of other branded products which are there. Now, maintaining a catalog on ONDC, because finally what happens is that the buyer experience that should be that should be as good as, or if not better than, what the existing platforms provide. Now, how do we do that? So one is that they have to maintain a catalog. Now, maintaining a catalog is not very easy. So, for example, there are lots of different kinds of products that you have, and we maintain different kinds of attributes for the products. We maintain images for the products. We make sure that that information is up to date. Plus, there is also the issue of fake products. So somebody has Ashirvad Atta, somebody could call it Ashirvade Atta, and buyer will get confused. Which is the real one, which is the fake one. So one of the things that we are working on is a distributed catalog of branded products. So there are a lot of these brand owners who have expressed their interest in working with us. So what we are doing is trying to set up a distributed catalog of all these branded products along with them, so that they maintain their own catalogs. So, for example, Ashirvad Atta, there are different types of SKUs. For example, there'll be like a 1 kg, 2 kg, 5 kg, 10 kg, and all that. Plus, there is a unique identifier for each SKU of Ashirvad Atta. So they maintain their own catalogs, and we provide a way for each of the merchants, who publish the catalog on ONDC, to kind of refresh it from there. So in other words, they don't have to go and click pictures and upload a lot of this information, because there's a lot of these kinds of mundane activities, which kind of diverts their attention from their real goals. So a distributed catalog of branded products is something that we want to maintain to enable it for all participants to actually refresh it as and when they want to. This will definitely reduce their overhead. Indic language support, this is something which is very key for us. Now, one of the things that we found out in ONDC is that if you see, there are many different legs of a transaction. So, a buyer makes an order through a buyer app, it goes to a seller app does the kind of order processing, the fulfillment could happen through a logistics provider. So there are many different legs that are a part of a transaction. Now, at any point of time, all these different legs of a transaction should be in sync. Otherwise, there are going to be issues. Now, a very simple example is something like a order status update. So in a platform world, it's pretty easy. There's only one place you update, everybody else gets to see it. But in the network world, what happens is that the logistics provider will update the status. That has to be synced back to the retail seller, which has to be synced back to the buyer app. How do we make sure that, and there are cases where we see that, okay, there's a merchant who didn't understand what exactly shipped means, because we are all English, right? So we have all these English status definitions. They don't understand what shipped means. So, at times, before they have even shipped it, they have changed the status, and the buyer doesn't get it for like a few days, or they forgot to change the status, even after the product has been shipped. So that is one part. Second part is all the catalogs and everything else that we have today that's in English, but we actually want to enable Indic language support, so that when we finally have all the kirana stores and the Kone Ka Panwala on ONDC, they should be able to converse in their own language. Now this is a very key focus for us. So we want to so we are a Made in India initiative, and we want to talk in India as well, with complete Indic language support. The protocol-based negotiation, this is a pretty interesting concept, as I mentioned before. Now, one of the things that we do in protocol-based negotiation is that I'll just give some nuances about how exactly it works. So, for example, there is a buyer app that comes in. Now, buyer app has a commercial model. So they bring in the buyers, so they generate the demand, so they need a commercial model. So we have something called a finder fee for a buyer app. Now we have different types of buyer apps. One buyer app might say that, okay, I'll charge, let's say, 2% of the order value as buyer app finder fee. Somebody else might say I'll charge 5%. Now what we do is we enable them to transact. So there is a way that they can actually communicate, saying that, okay, this is my finder fee, And whosoever accepts it, you are free to publish a catalog and transact with the buyer. Whoever doesn't accept it, you need not respond. That is one thing. The other part is who collects the payment. Now, there could be like a prepaid payment, but prepaid payment collection could be by the buyer, it could be by the seller. Now, who exactly gets to collect the payment? Or should it be a COD at all or not? Now, even when payment gets collected, there are a lot of different terms and conditions like, okay, what is the collection basis? So, for example, I collect the payment. When do I get to settle it? Is settlement at the time of collection? Is it at the time of fulfillment? Is it at the time of delivery? Is it at the time of shipping? All these permutations and combinations exist today. Even the settlement window, for example, like today it's pretty easy that all the platform owners, they basically settle X number of days after fulfillment. But here there is a negotiation which is in place. So a merchant might say that, okay, I'll let you collect, but I want settlement within 3 days of collection, for example. Now that is something they can actually transact over the protocol, and they can come to an agreement, and once a consensus is reached, then the transaction can go through. Now, the technology for small merchants. Now, here we have quite a few interesting initiatives. We actually had a hackathon in the month of January where we came up with, we called it the Innovation Hackathon, where we came up with a lot of interesting problem statements, and I know many thought workers, and I'm sure many other participants in the audience today were a part of it. So we had some interesting problem statements. One was about fast digitization of catalogs. So we gave a challenge statement which was to digitize a catalog of about 100 SKUs in 15 minutes. And we had some pretty interesting solutions in terms of how exactly you can digitize the catalog. So it could be something as simple as there could be like a backend AI model where, through voice input or image input or, some other way, you actually, you give an input for a particular SKU item, and that automatically does some level of auto classification and tells you that, okay, this aloo means, potato, and potato is, this particular type of grocery, and, these are some of the attributes of potato, and this is the price. So there are different ways that you can actually input it so that, that becomes a part of the digital catalog. And there are quite a few interesting startups in the country who are actually working on this kind of technology. So one of them actually provides technology for Kirana store, for all the thelawalas. They can actually give voice input, and using the voice input, the catalog gets maintained on its own. So first of all, you create a catalog and then you maintain a catalog. So once you sell something, you can actually, through a voice interface, you can actually give an input, and the catalog gets kind of auto-maintained. So one is the digitization of catalog, and there were quite a few interesting, solutions that came in, and we actually want to productize a lot of that through the ONDC participants. So fast digitization and lifecycle management of catalogs. The other part is about the dynamic pricing and inventory management. So a lot of these kinds of technologies, these are actually available to the high-end vendors. So if you look at the Walmarts, the Amazons, and all that, they have these kinds of technologies in place. But how do we kind of mainstream these types of technologies? So for example, if a Kirana, so if you look at thelawalas, when they come, they actually bring fresh produce, but they have a fixed price because they don't know, whether they can charge more or whether they should charge less and all that. So how can we take technologies like dynamic pricing and we mainstream it, for thelawalas, so that they can also, customize their price just like the high-end vendors do today. Right? So again, there are different kinds of pricing models that you can come up with. You can come up with intuitive user interfaces, which you can ask participants to, use, and they give inputs in different forms, and it automatically computes a price and tells them. So you could pretty much, dynamically compute price on a product by product basis or on order by order basis. Inventory management, this is key. How do I make sure how much of inventory do I bring in? So if I bring in too much of inventory, then half of it goes waste, and that's a problem for the thelawala or the kirana store. So the non-deterministic inventory management, this is a pretty interesting problem. We had some interesting submissions on this. How do we kind of right size these kinds of technologies and enable it at population scale, so that any of these small merchants can actually get access to it. The trustless digital commerce. Now today the only component of the network that ONDC maintains is something called a registry. So registry is actually a list of all the participants, and the reason we maintain the registry is to make sure that all transactions that happen, it happens between genuine network participants. So if somebody tries to impersonate somebody else, and tries to do a transaction on the network, that is not going to go through because, we have the required mechanisms in place in the registry. Now, if you look at what we do today, in the registry, we actually maintain public keys. So there's a public signing key, there's a public encryption key that we maintain for each participant. So when I send a transaction to you, for example, you'll actually get to see, you can actually, you know who has sent it. You can check the public key from the registry, and you can actually check whether, I've actually sent it or not. Plus, there's a hash of a payload which you can use to verify whether the transaction is genuine, whether it has been tampered or not. Now, if you see, there are two things I am doing. I'm identifying myself that I'm a participant in the network. Second is I am signing it, saying that okay, I'm making a promise that I'll honor this. So in other words, there's like non-repudiability on my part. Now, the same thing can be done through something like a trust or a promise ledger. That okay, I'm promising you something. I can make that information public, and anybody that wants to check whether I made that promise, for that particular order, they can actually go and check a trust ledger. So pretty much whatever we are trying to do through a registry, it could be done through this. But this is something that is being thought about, by many people in the industry. But it's I think we are still some way away from that. But I think one day we'll get to that, making it completely trustless. So instead of a registry, have some way to have decentralized trust and promise ledgers, so that whatever I'm trying to do through signing and through the registry, that can actually be taken care of through this mechanism. Verifiable transactions. This is something which we actually take some inspiration from the crypto world, which is, anytime somebody mines a crypto, they know whether it is, whether the transaction is verifiable or not. They have ways to verify that. There are all these, the POW plus a lot of other mechanisms that we have. Now, this is something that is still in our wish list. We are trying to think through how exactly we can do that, but hope is that one day we can enable this also. The governance part of it. Now, ONDC is after all a network, and anybody that comes onto the network, we need to do some minimum checks to make sure that they are a genuine participant. They comply with the laws of the land. So ONDC is not a regulator, but all the participants, they need to comply with the law of the land. And one of the examples is that merchants, they need a GST number, for example, to do digital commerce. I know the rules have changed recently. So there is a set of information that we need from participants before we can actually add them onto the ONDC network. So what we are doing is, plus there are also the other things which I talked about in terms of the onboarding, which is that we maintain the public keys. So basically there are decentralized identifiers. Participants have to generate the decentralized identifiers, they maintain it, and then we also verify the signature. So there are a minimum set of checks that we need to actually do to make sure that transactions are genuine on the network. Plus there are some checks that we need to do to make sure that the participant on the network is actually genuine, and therefore they follow the laws of the land. So how do we make the process of onboarding seamless? So if you look at it, let's say I try to register on ONDC as Microsoft.com, for example. Obviously, ONDC will check to see whether I own that domain or not, right? They'll check to see whether I have a valid SSL certificate or not. So all these kinds of checks we have to do. I mean, those are bare minimum. We've tried to reduce the requirements to a bare minimum, but these are kinds of checks that we need to do to make sure that whoever we onboard is actually a genuine participant, plus they're compliant, with the laws of the land. Now, what we've done is, I know many of you would probably be working in our staging environment, where we have a manual process where you can just submit whatever information you want to and get added to the staging registry. But in production, it's very different, and we actually do all these checks. But we actually started with the kind of semi-automated mode, which is like a lot of back and forth steps and all that, and when in the month of April, when we did a pilot launch, it took us almost a week and a half to, onboard about 10 participants. Then what we've done is we're trying to move to a completely automated API, because there are lots of participants who bring in small kinds of merchants. So for example, the example that I typically get is like Manak Meva, for example, right? Manak Meva wants to be a participant on ONDC. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Manak Meva. They are a dry fruits merchant in ONDC. They're a great store, by the way. So they have quite a few points of presence in Bangalore. And if they want to come on board ONDC, now obviously they don't have a IT person to understand, what exactly is this decentralized ID and what is private key, what is public key, and what is SSL certificate and all that. So how do we enable them to come on board ONDC? How can we create a process for onboarding which is as seamless as possible. So what we did was we tried to move from, kind of semi-automated process where it took us almost 10 days to onboard 5 participants to now where we have a API which does almost 95% of the automation. There are still some things that we are trying to figure out, but using that we actually onboarded almost 10 participants in like a few hours, about a couple of weeks back, in a different environment. So we are trying to make it like completely invisible and as seamless as possible so that tech service providers who actually enable a lot of these merchants, they don't have to go through hassles and they can actually onboard at scale. The tiered compliance, now there are certain compliance requirements. For example, we talked about ODR, like dispute resolution. There could be a need for an ops team, to make sure that grievances and disputes are handled correctly, plus all the compliance requirements and all that. Now, the tiered compliance, so if I am like, I own like a, Mohalla Kirana store, I don't need to follow the same levels of compliance as somebody like, somebody who does like 1 million transactions a day. Now that is something that we are going to enable for tiered compliance. So maybe I don't have to do ODR, I don't need to maintain an operations team, but the one who does 1 million transactions a day needs to do it. So these are some of the initiatives that we are actually looking at. Many of these things are work in progress. Other things we need to take up, but all of these are like top priority for us. And this is how we plan to enable, how we plan to democratize digital commerce in the country. Now, here are some of the opportunities in tech that we have. So there is a requirement for SDKs. So we actually need lots and lots of SDKs. From ONDC itself, we have, we actually create reference apps. So we have a reference buyer app today, which is, it's like a retail buyer app. We have a web version, we have a mobile version. We also have an SDK, which actually provides these APIs. But there is an opportunity for lots and lots of SDKs. Now we have a similar initiative which we are running called the Accelerator Program for ONDC. So anybody that can create an SDK, which is abstracted to such a level that a participant just needs to put their value-added layer on top of it and enable an app for ONDC, I think that would be super useful. Because in ONDC, we have different types of participants. So for example, there are participants who, by the way, I forgot to mention one thing, which is about the protocol itself. The APIs are async and they are server-side. Now, most of us who come from the platform world, we initially struggled to figure out, okay, what exactly are async APIs? It doesn't work the same way as sync APIs do. But we have all kinds of participants on ONDC. So on the one end, we have participants who come and tell us, "Acha, ye async kya hota hai?" And then on the other side, there are participants who download our protocol, who check our specs, look at the protocol. They don't even interact with us. Then 2 weeks later, they actually send you a demo saying that, oh, we have a seller app for, let's say, pharmacy. Now, we haven't yet started pharmacy, but with our reference buyer app, they've actually created a seller app because we have all the transaction contracts and all that enabled in our buyer app. So it's not that easy to create a seller app in 2 weeks. So we have participants, at either, that cover the entire spectrum. Some of them are very tech savvy, some of them are not. So, there is a requirement for SDKs, which basically abstracts out a lot of the complexities in the network. And, there are people that struggle with things like signing and verification, for example, which is one of the key pieces in ONDC, from generating a keys. So there is always this confusion, this whole concept of centralization versus decentralization. When some of us started working on ONDC, it was a challenge for us as well. It took us several months to even grasp it. And most of us are techies, I come from a tech background, and understanding this, it took me a little bit of time. So there are participants who ask us, okay, why don't you give us like a centralized, service where we generate the keys and we sign and we verify. So we tell them that, look, that is not our job because this network is decentralized. We don't want to keep your private keys. We don't want to know what your private keys are. And if you know your private keys, we can actually, tap into your transaction and figure out what exactly you're sending. So this whole concept about, decentralized identity, which is, giving participants the chance, to generate their own keys, sign it, verify it, and make sure that they are responsible for their security, their catalogs, their data. That takes a bit of time. So I think there is a requirement for lots and lots of these kinds of utilities, which are required on ONDC. So we have a reference app, and we have a SDK which we open sourced. But there is an opportunity for software providers, startups, and others to actually create SDKs and build a commercial model around it. There are lots of features like you can do integration with maps, cloud calling, inventory management systems, dynamic pricing systems, catalog management systems, so the logistics systems. So lots of different kinds of features and functions are possible through the SDK. Lightweight apps, again, this is something that to enable to actually bring in buyers and merchants from tier 3 and tier 4 cities, where even the mobile bandwidth may not be what we get in Bangalore today. We need apps that actually work. So we are talking about 5G, and now there is 6G auction which is going on. So we can actually we need apps which actually operate, let's say, in 2G or 3G. And it could also be apps which have like some which work on feature phones, for example. If you look at tier 3, tier 4 kind of cities, the type of the people in those cities, plus the tech restrictions in terms of bandwidth availability, or the feature or the types of phones that they have access to. So any lightweight apps that we can create for them, which enables them to transact on the network, that will be super useful. Super apps, this has been on our wish list for quite some time. Many people told us that India is not ripe for super apps, but they also told us that if you look at how far we've come in ONDC, I don't think anybody bet that we would come this far, in this span of time. So I think super apps, this will be really useful, super useful, where with one particular app you can actually transact across different domains and provide like a completely seamless experience. Intuitive guided buying experiences. Again, this was also one of our innovation hackathon challenge statements, where we said that for an audience that doesn't know how to use a mobile phone, for example, how do you create an app? And one of the participants, who actually got a prize in this challenge statement, she was telling me that, and she has a pretty interesting background, and what she told me was that, when she actually started helping out her grandmother, and she realized that, people have trouble even understanding how to take an SMS, and a lot of these OTP verifications happen. So you get an SMS with an OTP, how to take that SMS and put it into that app. People actually struggle with that. So all of us who are from a tech background, privileged background, we, I think, tend to ignore these kinds of problems. But actually coming up with an intuitive guided buying experience, which is that, okay, what exactly is search? I mean, we know what a search is, but for somebody who doesn't know tech, okay, what exactly is search? What is the process of discovery? Okay, I do a discovery, what do I do next? that kind of a guided buying experience. That will be super useful, and we actually have had quite a few interesting discussions on this. There are companies, that are working on some kind of some interesting visual experiences, actually, like simulating, so that simulating, proper visual experiences on this. Decentralized ledgers for reputation, promise, and open data. I talked about that. The open data, online dispute resolution. If you look at consumer courts in the country today, these are kind of clogged with cases, and we need an online dispute resolution mechanism, and there are some early innovators in this, who've actually gone quite far with this. Formal programming languages, I actually wanted to spend 1 minute on this. I know Vinod is pushing me for time, but formal programming languages. So if you look at some of the things that we are doing in ONDC today, the spec is like in YAML. We write transaction contracts, and you'll be surprised if I tell you that our transaction contracts are in the form of Google Docs. We haven't yet found a proper formal programming language to actually codify it. So there are lots of opportunities here where we want to codify everything. Nothing Google Docs and all those kinds of things. Everything should be codified. Everything should be automated. Not just our transaction contracts. We're also looking at policies, codified policies. Actually, this is something interesting and something new. I don't think this has been done anywhere before. Reconciliation settlement services also is something that we want to talk about. This is something that, again, there's an opportunity for different service providers, because finally, if you look at it, that Kone ka Panwala, if he comes on ONDC, how does he know, how much money does he owe whom, and who owes him money, and when is that money going to come to him? So there are lots of these kinds of opportunities that are there in ONDC, and many of these things will actually have RFPs and all which will come out, but there'll be different service providers who will actually come in with these kinds of services. So I think that's all. Okay, so in passing, what I also want to mention is that one of my ex-bosses used to say that, the next step to ubiquity is invisibility. I think with ONDC, we have an opportunity to make digital commerce ubiquitous and invisible, so that it becomes a part of the mainstream, so that nobody questions it, at some point of time in the future. Thank you for the opportunity.